Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And I want to thank Sir June Camanars and Raymond Longson for inviting me to do this lecture. Good morning or good evening, as it most many of us are, um, depending upon whether the sun or the moon is in your sky. Um, as implied in my title, it is my hope today on Rizal's birthday to illustrate the process one person might go through in understanding Rizal. This lecture is a process of discovery and coming to an understanding of a text and an institution. And I think it will be clear throughout this lecture that reading and invoking Rizal is as much, if not more than, about us, the reader, as it is about Rizal. So first, a bit about how I got here. And let me, can I share my screen here?
Oh, okay.
Can? Okay, let's see.
Just a minute.
Okay,
Okay.
okay. Can you see this slide
Yeah.
here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. So
Yes.
here it is. That's me and my title.
Uh-huh.
And for those of you who are not familiar with the Knights of Rizal, it is an organization founded in the Philippines in 1911. Significantly, to me, and interpreting a lot of things, it's after the Philippine-American War and during American occupation of Ireland. Oh, let me. For those of okay, the official website describes the organization's charter as confirmed in 1951 by the Philippine legislature as thus. Um, the Order of the Knights of Rizal is a cultural, non-sectarian, non-partisan, non-racial, civic, and patriotic organization chartered under Republic Act 646 as an instrumentality by which the reteachings of our foremost national hero, Dr. Rizal, may be propagated among the Filipino people and others who may believe in his teachings to the end that they emulate and follow his examples. Personally, I have been a member of the order for over 20 years. In fact, I was invited to join after my father, who was also a member and past commander of the Hawaii chapter, after he passed away. So I was actually continuing two legacies, that of Rizal and that of my father. As it turned out, I was one of the few, maybe the only Filipino member in the chapter who was not born and raised in the Philippines. In a sense, I was and remain an outsider, or as some Filipino scholars will say today, a Phil foreigner. So I actually embraced this dubious status and label as a vindication to observe and write about the Philippines, not more objectively, but with a detached subjectivity that can illuminate events and ideas to a participant bias that is both known and acknowledged, something most writers rarely care about. This was 2011 before our pandemic, and that's the Phil Foreign in there. Okay. So over the past decade, I have written two papers on Rizal, published by the Knights of Rizal chapter, Hawaii chapter in 2013, and by the Knights of Rizal Aloha chapter in 2019. In the first paper, Unboxing Rizal's Legacy, I examined some assumptions made by Rizal, in particular by the Order of Knights of Rizal. My examination viewed the legacy not as a static collection of ideas passively passed on to us and which we should diligently and dutifully accept, but rather as a body of knowledge to be constructed in a process of active and critical reflection. This active concept of building a legacy is, in fact, promoted by Rizal himself in his essay, The Indolence of the Filipino. There, Rizal criticizes the colonial education in the Philippines. By contrast, the Spanish friars wrote memorizing education with the ideal student-centered education. We always talk about that in the university and in education, student-centered, not just memorizing facts. This was naturally a nod to Rizal's eclectic adoption of the philosophical traditions of the Enlightenment, as well as a form of secular humanism. The second paper, written 6 years later, Reflections and Shadows Revisiting Rizal, drew on an article by Ramon Guillermo, who examined the physics class chapter in Rizal's novel El Filibusterismo, and the correspondence between Rizal and his Austrian confidant, Ferdinand Blumentritt. In this dialogue between Guillermo, Rizal, and Blumentritt, I reflected on Rizal's possible position on the perennial nature versus nurture debate, as evidenced in the physics class discussion and his letter to Blumentritt, all within the context of the 19th century debates on genetics. My conclusion was that you can take Rizal out of the 19th century, as many of us often do today, but you can't take the 19th century out of Rizal. Thus, while Rizal was careful to place science's objectivity in a social historical context, one favoring induction over deduction, as characterizing scientific endeavors, his comments on inherited social status also exposed a 19th century prejudice of the biological bias for social hierarchy. More than being a man of our time, man still remains a man of his time. The Rizal text I focus on today, The Philippines, the Henry Sense, written between 1889 and 1890, is an essay included in a volume published by the in 2011 by the National Historical Commission of the Philippines for the 150th anniversary of Rizal's birth. So 10 years ago. Coincidentally, there we go. In 2011, my family and I actually visited my family's family in Los Baños, Laguna. While in Laguna, we also stopped by the Rizal Shrine in nearby Calamba, where a reproduction of Rizal's stands. So this essay, the Philippines, a Henry says, is pretty unique as it contains Rizal's ideas and criticisms of the Philippines of his day, as well as his visions of what the Philippines might look like a Henry since, roughly 1989 or 1990. I thought Rizal's imagining of the future was even more ambitious than Ridley Scott's 1982 movie, Blade Runner, which envisioned a Los Angeles only 37 years in advance. While Scott's vision of Los Angeles in 2019, and luckily it did not materialize, the movie did give us a fitting statement that could be applied to Rizal, especially on this day of his birth. A light that burns twice as bright, burns half as long. So before going further, I should disclose at this point my bias. It is my primary motivation for selecting my reading and lecture topic. On Thursday, February 23rd, 2017, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte received a sword symbolizing the rank of Knight Grand Cross of Rizal during the 21st International Assembly and Conference of the Knights of Rizal at the SMX Convention Center in Davao City. In his acceptance speech, Duterte said, "Your conferment upon me today, the Knight Grand Cross of Rizal, the highest degree the Knights of Rizal could give any person, is truly humbling. I must confess, however, that I suffer a sense of inadequacy, knowing that I stand before an assemblage of men who are so fused with patriotic fervor, deeply imbued with Dr. Rizal's ideals and visions, and dedicated to the diffusion of his writings and teachings. To say that Dr. Rizal was ahead of his time is no empty statement," he continues. "For instance, my administration has proposed to shift from governmental structure to a federal system, but that it is really nothing new for in this, Philippines, a Henry Sense also appears there." Yes, this is the same essay that I examined. So Duterte added that he wished to see the Knights of Rizal to support his campaign to federalize the government and urge people to re-examine the thoughts, aspirations, visions of Jose Rizal for the country, saying that his wisdom continues to be relevant to the nation in the present time. And Duterte closed with, quote, "You can be a Rizal, I can be a Rizal in our own modest ways, with the limits of our competence and capacities. We can all be Rizal, end quote. Of course, none of us can be Rizal unless Duterte wishes the youth to sacrifice themselves to remove an authoritarian government. No, we can only make honest and sincere efforts to follow and carry out Rizal's visions and ideals as set down in his writings. So even this attempt to emulate Rizal requires closer reading and understanding of him. Given what I know or knew about the reign of Duterte, however, I felt this award by this esteemed fraternity was inappropriate. To understand my negative reaction led me to revisiting what Rizal had to say about the nation and nationhood. Again, before revisiting the essay, I would like to demonstrate my theoretical bias in reading as an event. Here we go. Chicago. I recently returned from a quick trip in Chicago, Illinois. Here is the iconic skyline in the background with free-ranging Canadian geese foraging in Chicago's parks and waterways. In the beginning, Chicago welcomed the migrating geese. However, what was once seen as a conservation haven now has become a serious problem for Chicago. Once geese became acclimatized to the human habitat, they stopped migrating. Once the humans became tired of the geese, and most importantly, their poop, which brings up the next experience. One evening in Chicago, when boarding a bus on the South Side neighborhood, I noticed a large man walking with a walking cane, already waiting in the bus shelter. When the bus arrived, I motioned to him to get on the bus, as he was waiting there before me. After being shot a dismissive glance, I got on the bus and took an empty seat. The front ones, as you know, the ones that set aside for elderly folks like us, like me. The man with the walking cane followed, boarded the bus. When the bus surged ahead, he stumbled a bit before bracing himself against a seat across mine. Instinctively, I started to put out my hand to help him, to catch him in case he fell. The man apparently was watching and was aware of me, as he almost imperceptibly snapped, "Get your effing hand away from me." Taken aback, I was a bit surprised. Sure, I thought, okay, no help needed, even though he continued to stumble into his seat. So what to make of this event at this moment during this time? Even though we both wore masks, we were both easily recognizable as Asian and Black males. How much of today's contentious social and political climate could or should be brought into considering this event or this encounter, which barely lasted 10 seconds? Maybe it actually started when I first arrived at the bus stop, before the bus had arrived. I thought, was I being associated with the China virus? Was I seen as a real danger to his health? Or was my gesture of helping him only seen as a patronizing one? Yes, was he just having a bad day? Whatever that could mean. In the end, the movie buff in me took over, and running through my mind was that this was yet another moment, another Rashomon moment. Some of you may recall, Rashomon is a 1950 movie by Japanese director Akira Kurosawa. In the movie, a woodcutter telling a story to a Buddhist priest and another man about what had happened. The story is of a single event, the robbery of a couple that results in the death of the husband, but experienced by 4 people. At the trial, each person radically recalls different events. Each surviving witness provides the court with an entirely different narrative of what had happened. First, the wife of the deceased. She describes what happened. Then, the bandit himself, and it is our Toshiro Mufuri, describes the event. Next, the husband knows that everybody is tied up here. The husband also describes the event, who, of course, died during the event, but whose story is related to us through a medium. Okay. Finally, the bystander, who is describing all the events, has his story too. They all differ. Listening to this woodcutter, however, 2 other people they develop their own stories and they interpret the whole event differently. Finally, from a bird's eye view, that's us, we viewing the movie or the DVD, we have to put together our own interpretation of the events, but it's based no longer based on the characters or even the movie itself. It incorporates our own perspectives. Similarly, the subjectivity involved in my or anyone else's interpretation of my recent Chicago bus encounter goes beyond seeing the same things from different angles. The event, as experienced in the moment and subsequently recalled, involves pre-event understandings, better known as prejudices, and post-event understandings, perhaps known as reflections. Add to these biases overarching and individual orientations such as motives and intentions. So reading a text is no different. It is an event filtered through motivated, intentional, and emergent narratives, mostly formed beyond the narrative of the text. So I'd like to give this quote here, kind of like the meaning beyond the author's intent. With written discourse, the author's intention and the meaning of the text cease to coincide. The text's career escapes the finite horizon lived by its author. What the text means now matters more than what the author meant when he wrote it. Keep that in mind because I think that's one of the most important things we can remember here. So reading a text is much more than discovering an author's meaning. It's a dialogue between meaning-producing horizons. It is an event. Since reading an event is a meaning-producing one, readers experience text in different ways. The possible meanings and understandings produced through any single event of reading will vary between readers and readings. In fact, any event experienced by multiple participants will generate multiple meanings and understanding of that event, much like this event occurring now. And in fact, Rizal mentions this type of learning experience, when he criticizes the schooling that was happening in the Philippines, where people would just memorize things, and the learning was not based on each individual's experience. So moving on, the Philippines a century hence. The essay was written by Rizal while he was still in Europe. And I mentioned before, he was published during 1889 to 1890. While Rizal's prophetic power is interesting, predicting 100 years, hence, it is not as important to me as informing a meaning between the historical text and the events occurring more than a century hence, now, beyond this writer. With that in mind, let's look at the text. There's 4 parts to the text. The first part, let's see, to foretell the destiny of a nation, it is necessary to open the book that tells of her past. So he looks to the past first. Then he proceeds to describe the physical suffering, the moral and cultural degradation of subjugating fear brought upon the Filipinos. So after centuries of mistreatment, miseducation, misguidance, Rizal asks if the Philippines should remain a Spanish colony. And if so, what kind of colony? Should the Philippines become a separate but weakened country subject to being swallowed up by yet another colonial power? What is interesting too in this first section, Rizal uses Filipino to redefine Indios and Malay populations. So he modifies them by saying Filipino Indios, Filipino Malays, and everything becomes Filipino, except, and this is something that's kind of interesting for me for another lecture, except the Chinese. The Chinese are always excluded in being Filipinos. So what we can take away from this is perhaps the past always informs the present. Let's see, I can get this here. The past informs the present. It is here that Rizal poses the question, what would the Philippines be a century hence? And the emergent Filipino identity by bringing people together, defining them as with a single noun. Next, in section 2, Rizal makes seemingly endless comparisons. It's kind of interesting. Before and after eras, populations, and even drinking behaviors. Filipinos, like all Malayans, adapt to changes. see their former protectors as exploiters and executioners. Um, and then um, Filipinos set themselves apart because of the pro. Amor pro. This is probably, the Spanish is amor propio. Some of you might know this or have heard it before, but this is one of the key themes I want to continue on in a little while. I think it's very important for how Rizal sees the nation. So in this, just to quickly go over this one right now, but making comparisons as an analytical tool. These are related, so we'll keep that in mind, making comparisons and the amor proprio. In the third section, Rizal offers a DIY, the do-it-yourself plan for Spain to remedy the effects of 3 centuries of abuse and subjugation, but warns, quote, this transformation has to be violent and fatal if it should originate from the masses, peaceful and rich, result if from the upper classes. So he is looking to a top-down reformation of the Philippines. In particular, the 2 essential reforms that are needed: 1, a free press. Secondly, populate the colonial bureaucracy with native Filipinos, many of whom are not seditious-minded, but remain worthwhile, honorable, and loyal to Spain's honorable reputation and governance. Just to give you an indication of what he says, on promoting a free press, the nation wins respect by not covering up abuses, but by punishing them and condemning them. The free press will let government know the throbs of the public opinion. On establishing what I think is what he says, establishing a Filipino civil service, the government post should be filled to competitive examination. The examination results should be made public so that discontent would not arise and there would be encouragement. The posts occupied by the Indios, instead of endangering Spanish rule, will serve only to strengthen it. For what interest would they have to change what is secure and stable for the uncertain and problematic? The Indio, besides, is a lover of quietude and prefers a modest present to a brilliant future. Some very idealistic views. Finally, he's in the section 4. Discusses and compares various colonizing powers of the day, including Spain, France, England, Germany, Holland, China, Japan, and the United States. At the time of this writing, Rizal believed Spain to possess the goodwill and good sense to mentor Filipinos in taking control of the colonial government, or if destiny to form a nation modeled on Spain without any colonial aspirations. In another biological analogy, and he makes these often, Rizal presents a climatic comparison between Spain and Spaniards and Filipinos as distant related bovine brothers. Quote, the Spaniard is brave and patriotic and sacrifices everything in favorable moments for the good, for the motherland. He has boldness and determination of his bull. The Filipino does not love his country less, though he is more calm, peaceful, and not easily excited. Once started, he does not stop. For him, every fight means the death of one of the fighters. He preserves all the meekness and tenacity and fury of the Carabao. So climate influences equally bipeds and quadrupeds. End quote. Rizal sees England, Germany, and France as too outstretched with their current colonial obligations. Consider making a move on an abandoned Spanish colony. Likewise, Rizal does not imagine Holland, China, or, unfortunately, Japan as stretching their boundaries to include the Philippines. The only budding power Rizal sees as presenting a bothersome rival is the quote-unquote, the great American Republic, which had just begun to stretch its legs and had yet to acquire any portion of Africa. So given the right circumstances, in other words, growing greed and ambition, America would engage in global expansion. In the end, however, Rizal would still prefer Spain to do the right thing before spilling blood on Filipinos or Spaniards, or welcoming another world power into the Philippine shores. He makes a final plea to Spain to consider its moral legacy among Filipinos. We repeat, and we shall always repeat, while there is time, that it is better to anticipate the wishes of the people rather than to yield to force. The first, with sympathy and love; the second, contempt and indignation. So we do have here, Spain still can do the right thing, since no nation except the U.S. is capable of taking over the islands. I think we probably don't need to harp on the idea that Rizal was completely wrong about Japan also. So that part he completely missed. So the comparison we have, Rizal compares Islas Filipinas before and after during Spanish colonization, during which is a temporal comparison, and asks what has changed. Compared to other colonized peoples, Filipinos have retained their ability to adapt in accepting civilization, the technologies, increased travel, easing of interprovincial conflicts. Compared to other colonized peoples, Filipinos see their former protectors as exploiters and executioners. So, in other words, they're getting to be more wiser in terms of their colonizers. Compared to other colonized people, Filipinos have not, and this is the Rizal talking, Filipinos have not come under the influence of alcohol, what he considers the poison that has exterminated other natives of the islands in the Pacific. This is what he says here, but however, about the Filipinos. The peoples of the Orient in general, and the Malays in particular, are notable for their sensitiveness. In them predominates a nice sensibility of feeling. Even today, despite the contact with Western nations, whose ideals are distinct from theirs, we see the Malayan Filipinos sacrifice everything: liberty, comfort, welfare, name, on the altar of an aspiration, of a vanity, be it religious, scientific, or of any other character whatsoever. But at the slightest injury to his amour propre, he forgets all his sacrifices, and he never forgets the offense he believed he had received. So once again, um, his use of amour propre. It's a French term, um, and what I thought made it important was uh, in the translations that I used from the National Historical Commission, they use this term here. It is retained in the French and not the Spanish, original language of Rizal. But a previous translation by Charles Derbyshire, which is available on in the Gutenberg Library, he neglects to actually translate it at all and keeps it in English. So you never see this term. Some of you may remember this term if you studied, sociology or something in the Philippines. It's one of these four major values, value orientations that is always talked about as so close to the Filipino psyche. A more, in this case, a more proprio, tia, um, Utang old, and pakikisama. Of course, those are overused sometimes by scholars, but they are still useful, and even Filipino scholars still think it's useful to examine it. Obviously, Rizal thought is important. And to see what he might have known, a more vanity, a more self-love, two very different passions in their nature and their effects should not be confused. Self-love is a natural sentiment which inclines every animal to attend to its self-preservation, and which, guided by man in reason and modified by pity, produces humanity and virtue. Amour propre is only a relative sentiment, again, relative sentiment, factitious and born in society, which inclines every individual to set greater store by himself than by anyone else, inspires in men with all the evils they do one another, and is the genuine source of honor. This is Rousseau writing in his second discourses, and Rizal knew Rousseau, and in fact, when he went to Europe to study, he actually visited Paris and went to the Pantheon, where Rousseau's and Voltaire's bodies are stored or laid to rest. And he noted in his letters These two individuals, Voltaire and Rousseau, were the fathers of modern ideas. So he obviously knows what they're talking about. He's very familiar. But I would say, okay, well, we'll get to that. More on a more proper. What then is the true and best position one can enjoy in the ranks of humankind? The claims proper to one's person and the demands on others appropriate to that. In the natural order, since men are all equal, their common calling is man's estate. By man's estate, Rousseau means the order or rank of a man in the human community. He is articulating the notion of the moral standing of humanity with its rights and duties. Now the difference is, remember, Rousseau distinguished these two ideas, these two passions, these two sentiments that drive people. And one is more individualistic. That's the that's the one that actually he would say is that an animal passion. There's a more men. That is the one that drives self-preservation. That is individualistic. The other one requires people. It's a social one. That's why he calls it vanity, but it requires comparisons with other people. But it's, now people are saying, what people are also looking at is Rousseau also mentions the state, the natural order that other scholars are looking at is actually a social one. So it is only a standing with those among whom there is real equality of standing, a standing which incorporates the human dignity of each person, that there will be a reciprocity of regard and respect that is genuine in its significance and can form the basis for a moral community of common justice and benevolence. These are the notions of good and evil that accord best with the sense of the true relations of man. Dent and O'Hagan are contemporary writers writing on Rousseau about amor propre. So I should mention, Rousseau does not mention amor men, which is the individualistic one, Rousseau's natural passion of animal self-preservation. Instead, Rousseau only claims amor propre as the passion driving human relations. So we focus not so much on what I'll say, but on how he says it, we realize that making the comparisons is the core genesis of amor propre. For humans are naturally social beings, not individualistic, and as such, engage in making comparisons with and between others. I was thinking about, if we think about the first primordial man, once there was another being, so Adam plus Eve, and you can imagine the kind of comparisons that went on at that time. Don't need to explain more. Well, a more appropriate can result in destructive desires of vanity and envy. It is also the source of honor, where individuals perceive and realize the possibilities of improvements in themselves and others in the community. So it is a way to first look at others to see what's lacking in yourself. Why are there inequalities? And the idea is there's a motivation to remedy those inequalities, to improve yourself, to improve others. For Rizal, the overall goal of attending to one's amor propre is to seek social justice, equality, and the uplifting of one's community or the estate. Okay, this is actually, it's, I don't see my title here, on the nation and the nationhood. So Rizal does not define the nation in geopolitical terms, nor does he use racial or ethnic differences to circumscribe its borders. Some of you may know, Rizal even just thought of creating a community, Philippine community, outside of the Philippines. So staying in the Philippines, what was called the Philippines, was not as important as who's there, how are they going to behave as a community. He was also creating a new Filipino by combining different groups in the Philippines. Again, he does always ignore the Chinese too. I don't know why. I have more to say about that later. Instead, Rizal envisions a nation as a community of individuals whose amor propre is directed to the development and enhancement of their community. A nation and a sense of nation, therefore, derived from amor proprio of his people. Developing one's amor proprio is not fixed or static, but is a work in progress. So one is always trying to improve it. So what can be said of Rizal's nation could then be applied to the premier organization bearing his name. So remembering our past amor proprio. There was something I want to see if I can do this here. Um, to see remembering our past, and that would be from. Here we go. Share screen. Perhaps some of you will remember this. Hopefully, many of you will. This is 100 years hence, about 100 years hence of Rizal.
At the beginning, it sounded like it was a military coup or uprising. We began asking ourselves whether we should go out there and support that uprising. For that instant, people were of one mind. You get Marcos out, whatever it takes. We had been under martial law for 14 years, and people in a way had gotten used to martial law. President Marcos and his wife Imelda, they ruled together a very dark and cruel dictatorship. In 1986, Cory Aquino was prevailed upon to run against Marcos in a presidential election when Marcos cheated her out of the presidency. This led to massive protests and a revolt of a few military officers who could no longer take Marcos and his name. The people came out and protected the rebel army. It was like a huge picnic, actually. I was there with my wife. I was there with our daughter, taking a gamble on freedom. We found our voices. We found a courage that had receded too far in many of us. But we knew that on the periphery of this movement were Marcos's massed forces who would, at one command, descend on us. It was the people you least expected, the nuns and the priests, women who took to the forefront and met the soldiers and the tank commanders with food and flowers. We were out on the street, and there was a sniper up in one of the towers, firing down, but not really at people, but on the street. People would scatter, and then nervous laughter would be heard, and then we would slowly, giggling, crawl back to our previous position. No Filipino really wanted to kill a fellow Filipino. It just wasn't worth it. Marcos wasn't worth it. Defections took place by the minute, by the hour. Within the space of 4 days, Marcos would be gone.
Mr. Marcos and his family had fled by helicopters under American guarantee. One of his generals gave me the first official confirmation. Has he left the country? I don't know, but he's no longer there. So Mr. Aquino is now the ruler of his
Yes. The nation just exploded in euphoria. It made me feel myself worth again as a Filipino citizen, that I had something more to live for. for myself and my family and my country.
Okay. Okay. So that's an example of, I think, on a national scale, what a more can that be? Oh, sorry. Hold on. Okay. And what I shall do is come back to our um, share. Okay. Come back to this. So what we have here, whoops, sorry. We have got to get up to where we were. Okay, there we go. Okay. So freedom of press. This is now I'm going to look at our contemporary things. The Knights of Rizal and the reign of Duterte. The first essential institution that Rizal required for proper, in other words, moral governance, is a free press. So 100 years hence, from Rizal's essay, was marked, as you saw, by the end of the Marcos regime, the People Power Revolution, and the presidency of Corazon Aquino. The lifting of Marcos's martial law and his strict clampdown on the press loosened up a bit. But all subsequent presidents, I'll admit this, all subsequent presidents since Marcos have had variable and contentious relationships with the Philippines' multifaceted and strongly opinionated press. What Rizal might consider desirable and necessary for weighing public opinions and ensuring government accountability has often been supplanted by censoring, banning, and the demonizing through red tagging, as was explained last week. Duterte is not new to these restrictions, but has been more heavy-handed than other presidents. So examples are the suppression of the Rappler reports, the reporter, especially by Maria Rissa, and the non-renewal of ABS-CBN broadcast franchise. How about a populist government? Populist governments are attractive, and in fact, everybody likes to say Duterte is a populist president. Well, they're attractive in theory because they promote reductions in social inequalities and increases in political participation. Compared to a government populated by Spaniards, Rizal wanted a civil service staffed by Filipinos. While a Filipino civil service is not a given, now the question is it representative of all Filipinos? So in a recent study by two economists, they asked the question: is Duterte a populist? And after 4 years in office, the study in 2020, they find Duterte's government has actually increased the share of what's called fat dynasties. Those are dynasties with two or more members in elected office. And instead of the promised increase in political participation through the destruction of oligarchies, Duterte's policies have only transferred positions of power and economic rents from one wealthy clan to another. In another, Tuano and Cruz, they point to improvements in economic inequality indicators, but his war on drugs has taken a toll on the poor and assaulting civil rights and freedoms. So we end up with human rights abuses. So while Duterte's policies maintain a free press and alleviate social and income inequalities has largely been ineffective, what has stood out is his war on drugs. This radical law and order policy permitting extrajudicial killings is what first led me to question the Knights of Rizal's decision to award Duterte its highest honor. And it led me to revisit what Rizal had meant when writing about nationalism and nationhood. With some 8,000 to 24,000 estimated, plus Filipinos killed by Filipinos, the reign of Duterte doubtless seems to be contrary to the basic tenets of the Knights of Rizal, but more significantly in defiance to the word and spirit of Rizal himself. So my purpose in examining the text by Rizal was to explore the possibility of multiple interpretations and understandings generated by different readers. While nowhere in the Knights of Rizal Code of Ethics or Objectives is there specific mention of a free press, there are specific objectives directed toward promoting personal and civic engagement and participation in one's nation. In fact, developing and expressing patriotism is one of the main themes flowing throughout the Code of Ethics and Objectives. The other theme, based on its prevalence and generality, is nonetheless a more fundamental one. And that is to embody and promote the ideals of resolve. Thus, a resolvist is defined by one's moral character and fortitude. A resolvist, and these are just many things here, strives to do justice, values honor, is tolerant and understanding toward others, promotes social justice, is truthful and honest, is conscious of the plight of the less fortunate. In other words, resolve develops and displays a deep sense, resolvist develops and displays a deep sense of profound amour propre. This is the same amour propre resolve believes to be the foundation of a moral community. It is the same amour propre permeating the Knights of Ethics. And I believe by awarding the Church its highest honor, the order has diminished the sense of amour propre that should be guiding us. Instead of awarding an authoritarian leader who has demonstrated over and over disregard for due process, support for extrajudicial killings, misogynist rhetoric, and hateful speech, the Knights of Rizal demonstrate that it has been guided not by amour propre, but by the non-Rizalian amour systemem, the primitive passion for self-preservation. Now, I'm almost done. We have Hawaii now. The Knights of Rizal chapters in Hawaii. More than 5,500 miles from the Philippines. If you travel there, you end up luckily in Hawaii, where we find not one but two chapters. The Knights of Rizal, the Hawaii chapter and the Aloha chapter. In 2019, the last picture I had of myself and the other knights, there was only one chapter. And when I would like to blame, while I like to blame the split on the pandemic or a chapter exceeding its carrying capacity for members, those were clearly not the case. So there we are, Hawaii. Like the Philippines, Hawaii is made up of several islands. However, all our knights are located on one island. Filipinos often point to the habit of Filipino organizations splitting up because of disagreements between members. Well, not limited to the Filipino community, the centrifugal forces within an organization, especially one such as the Knights of Rizal, should be neutralized by the Code of Ethics exerting a constant centripetal force promulgated to maintain group identity and cohesion. But as noted before, everyone has their own interpretation and understanding of any text, and in this case, the Knights of Rizal Code of Ethics. One cannot and should not follow the Code of Ethics without trying to interpret and come to an understanding of it for oneself. What one can do, however, is to read and interpret the code as well as the objectives as a step in constituting or reconstituting one's amour propre. For Rizalists, the understanding of a code of ethics and objectives must be formed and conducted through and for the purpose of developing one's amour propre. So, in conclusion, the first step in interpreting a text. Texts are interpreted by readers and are understood relative to each other's biases, prejudices, and intentions. The event of reading will result in different understandings by different readers. My interpretation of Rizal's essay, The Philippines 1 Century Hence, is, in addition to anything else, a statement on how to morally constitute a nation through the development of one's amour propre. The failure to adequately develop one's amour propre results in actions counter to Rizal's morally constituted nation. Some of you may recognize this. It's a famous saying, those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I would like to offer you something additional to that. Those who fail to reflect upon the present will condemn the past. And that's pretty much what I have to say. Salamat po sa inyong lahat. Oh, Miss Moriarty.